Hi, this is Blake Buettner, Managing Editor of Worn & Wound. Today, we're talking about the Rolex GMT-Master, new and old. A big thanks to Bob's Watches for lending us the reference 1675 seen in this video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. Now in front of me I have two different references of the Rolex GMT-Master. One is the reference 1675, the other is a newer reference 12670 BLRO. Neither of these are new watches. The 1675 went out of production in 1980 after a nearly 20-year span in production, and the 12670, let's just call it the BLRO from now on, I think that'll be easier, in steel, made its return in 2018, of course. And just this past year, finally received the Oyster bracelet once again. I've got a bit of a personal connection to these watches, and I thought it'd be fun to compare and contrast the old with the new, see what's been gained, what's been lost, and talk about why I have one of these watches in my collection still, but not the other. The 1675 is the first vintage Rolex that I ever bought. This was more than 10 years ago, and I paid well under $5,000 for it. Times have changed a lot since then. It's a reference that I still love to this day. For all intents and purposes, not as good of a watch as the modern one, but as you've heard a million times, there's a charm here to the old one. And there's a certain aura to the Pepsi bezel that I think has captured a lot of our hearts and minds as we've gotten into this hobby. These, of course, age in very different ways, from the dial to the hour plots to the bezel. The example I have in front of me has a very crisp red and blue, or as Rolex calls it, blue and rouge, the BL and the RO. Visually, it's a much tidier package than the newer watch, of course. From the top down, the lugs are much trimmer. It appears to be a little thinner because the case wall is much smaller. In reality, it is actually almost a millimeter thicker than the newer model, thanks largely to the acrylic crystal here. Now, looking at these two together, they're still obviously the same watch, but there's a lot of differences that you'll notice. First and foremost, the matte dial has been shifted to a glossy dial. The tritium hour markers are replaced with high-tech lume and white gold surrounds, and of course, it's just kind of more robust at every angle. While you do feel that on the wrist, the newer model is still relatively comfortable, and in relation to many other watches that we see nowadays, I would say is still very wearable. Now, looking at these watches together is very interesting. They are clearly of the same family. The watches look pretty much the same since 1954 and the reference 6542. It's easily identifiable from across the room, just like the new version. Now, what's been lost here is the simple matte dial, the acrylic crystal. The bezel has changed, the bezel insert, I should say, has changed from aluminum to ceramic. Overall, there's just a more robust presence to every detail in the newer model. Of course, some of that charm has been lost, but the 1675 has quite a few more years under its belt, and I reckon that the newer model will gain some of that charm in equal amount of time. Sure, the hour markers might not fade into the same type of color, and the bezel might not go to fuchsia or anything like that, but I wager you'll still be able to see some age make its way into this model as generations go by. Now, the new watch is better in pretty much every conceivable way. It's got a lot of the bells and whistles that you expect on modern Rolexes now. This is using the 3285 movement that has features like chronology escapement, paraflex, parachrome, you name it, it's all in there. It keeps great times, a 70-hour power reserve. It's clearly the better watch of the two. I love wearing the 1675. It wears so svelte on the wrist. You can hear that bracelet. That's kind of a trademark vintage watch bracelet sound. The new bracelet is miles better. You're not getting any kind of sound like that. The 1675 uses a rather legendary movement, the 1575. Watchmakers really enjoy this movement. It was in production for about 15 years. Now, the new model has an independently adjustable hour hand, so it's really easy to adjust to local time when you're traveling with this watch. The older models have a 24-hour hand that's slave to the hour hand, so all the hands are moving in concert with one another, forcing you to rely on the rotating bezel for a second time zone. Now, as I mentioned, the 1675 was the very first vintage Rolex reference that I bought. It didn't last too long. My father helped me out of a pickle, so as collateral, I lent him my 1675, and he ended up wearing it for years. Of course, by the time I got it back, the world of vintage watches, and vintage Rolex in particular, had changed considerably. No longer was it a hobby for nerds or those in the know. It was kind of part of a culture shift that had happened. all of a sudden cool people, fashionable people were wearing these things. That wasn't exactly me, so the watch didn't last in my collection too much longer, and it's one of the big regrets that I have today. But it did shift in how I think about these things, and I never really owned these things as investments or to speculate on them. I just enjoyed wearing them and using them, and that's still how I think about watches these days. Now, comparing the two of them, I actually prefer the look of the old one. I prefer how it wears and how it feels on the wrist. Using the new one and reading the new one is a little bit easier. When it comes to everyday wear, washing the dishes, playing with the kids, all that kind of stuff, I prefer wearing the newer one as well. And it's something that I hope to build the same kind of memories in as a lot of these vintage 1675s hold today. Now, these two watches illustrate the vast differences between a modern Rolex and a vintage Rolex, yet the spirit is still kind of retained. They're still obviously the same watch and model. And if you grew up wearing or seeing 1675, you'll probably find a lot of comfort in the newer BLRO. Of course, it's worth acknowledging that the modern BLRO is not exactly accessible from retailers these days. The MSRP of this watch is $10,550, a little bit more if you opt for the Jubilee bracelet. However, the real-world market of it is something around 3 times that amount, which is a little problematic if you're someone who buys these things to wear every day and use every day. You don't want to have to treat these things like an investment, but that's kind of what they've become, sadly. These are two beautiful executions of the Rolex GMT-Master. If you set aside all the hype, all the cultural elements that are a little less flattering to the hobby, you're left with some pretty incredible watches here. You can catch my full thoughts on both of these watches on Worn and Wound right now. Be sure to check out the site for the full story on the 1675.